all about writing with Ben and Sara.
Welcome to All About Writing, the podcast that covers everything about the world of writing from the inside out. This is episode 17, part 3 of our series on writing craft. I'm Sara, here with my co-host Ben, who is an award-winning best-selling author and ghostwriter, editor, and publisher.
And I'm Ben, here with my co-host Sara, who's an award-winning best-selling author, screenwriter, editor, and TED Talk presenter. And today, it is all about the climax. It might seem strange that we're going to talk so early in our series on writing craft about the thing that happens at the end of the book, but there is a method to our madness. And if it's okay, Sara, I'm just going to jump right in here because this is a big deal for me about
There's so many euphemisms. So many euphemisms happening right now. It's like inappropriate. I feel like we need our spouses. Anyway.
Okay, so the climax. The climax is the most important scene in the book. Everything else in the book points towards it. Everything else in the book leads inevitably to it. And so if this isn't the case, there are several possibilities. One, your climax isn't what you think it is. Or two, some parts of your book are extraneous and need to be changed to either point towards the climax or just get cut. So that's it. That's my little rant on why the climax is important. Sara, thoughts?
I think it is interesting because I want to talk about how everybody thinks that the climax has to happen at the very end of the book. And I think in some cases that's true-ish, but I think we forget that, you know, you still have a lot of loose ends after the climax to wrap up. So as much as we say, it is what everything leads to in a book, that can be a misleading phrase because it isn't the end. It isn't to what it is to what, you know, you've been building toward, all your hooks, all of the, you know, the little hints and clues that you've provided your readers along the way. But once it happens, unless you're letting your book end on a cliffhanger, which is another way to work with the climax in a book, which we can talk about, but you have kind of a chunk after to wrap it up. Right? Like whether it's explaining or going and doing a little backstory or whatever it is. So I think, you know, the climax isn't like the end of the book, but it is your highest point in that graph of discussing, you know, the different acts. And I think it'd be interesting though, you know, I think we both would agree that we would say that the climax does happen in the third act of a book. A traditional
you're
act.
absolutely right. The climax isn't the end of the book. That's true. But it does happen towards the end of the book. Simply because, from a dramatic perspective, you're talking about the graph, the graph of the rising tension that goes up. Well, that highest peak is the climax. That's where everything that you've been building comes to a head and is resolved. Yes, there can still be stuff that happens after the climax. You're right. The mopping up, the final tying off of loose ends. What do they live happily ever after? Right. I mean, those things. It's often called the denouement, and it's the stuff that happens after the climax to just wrap up the story. But I think it's important to say that there shouldn't be more drama happening after the climax. The stuff that happens after the climax is exactly that. It's the wrapping up. It's the did they get home safe, or do we see them after the events that were the climax, and are they doing okay, right? A famous example, which I hate to criticize, but if you've listened to this podcast, you'll know I will, is Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. The climax of the book really is the destruction of the ring. The whole story is about the destruction of the ring, and that happens towards the end of book 3. When
I know where you're going with this. Yes, keep going. Yep.
In the books, not the movies, you'll note, but in the books, there's a whole other section when the hobbits return to the Shire, but Saruman's forces have raised the Shire, and they gotta fight some more, and whatever. Who am I to criticize?
Saruman is still alive in the books at the end. He's the old man that's screwing up the Shire, and you're like, wait, what?
Yeah,
What is
exactly.
going on?
And that's a, you know, again, not to criticize Tolkien, but that's a great example of he needed a better editor to say, JRR, we got to sort this out before we get back there. Because the big drama, the whole story is about destroying the ring. Once the ring is destroyed, then you can have your time to have the celebrations, you know, where Aragorn is king, and yeah, the hobbits come home, and yeah, we know what happens to everybody, and yes, they get on the boat and head off. Sure, that's all great. That's all denouement. That's after the tension has been exploded, and now it's all, let's have our happily ever after story. We don't want more conflict at that point. So
Are you
that's actually
saying
an example
that
of.
the movies did it better by getting rid of that whole section at the end? Are you
I'm
saying
afraid they did. Yep, they said, we just don't need that, and they were right. You
they
know,
were right? And actually, he could have kept that whole section in, and I guess that's something to point out too. That if you have something big and bold like the fight for the Shire, right? In Tolkien, as an example, we'll stick with that. And you think, well, this is still really important. We want to show that like they were really fighting for their home, and that the little people could still rise up, and in the terms of that world, and the that whole part of the fight for the Shire could have, to your point with an editor, could have stayed in the book, but be sprinkled in earlier on.
hmm hmm
The way that he kind of goes back and forth between multiple locations already, he could have
yeah,
sprinkled that in, and then of course when our hero hobbits come back from destroying the ring in this huge long journey and show up to the Shire, and it's not what they remember leaving, and they find out what had transpired at the end, that would have been, at least in this day and age, a more traditional way to finish up the very long post climax that Tolkien does.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, that's a really great visual example, and for anybody who needs it to be, to have an example of what not to do in a way, go read the
Yeah.
last like fourth of Return of the King, and then you can see.
Exactly. So, and it's a great example actually because Tolkien is a tremendous writer and he's very successful. So you might think, oh well, I can do this because Tolkien did it. Well, a couple of things. One, Tolkien was such a groundbreaker that he was able to break a few rules and get away with it. But also, he was writing a long time ago, and and styles do change. I mean, a lot of the things that Charles Dickens did, we can't really do anymore. He used way too many words when it comes to modern writing. You just can't write the way Dickens did. And that's something that as an author today, you have to understand that styles change over time and the norms change over time. But when it comes to the climax, this is pretty constant. The climax is the highest point of tension in the book, but because of that, everything else that you do in the book has to some way point towards it. And what that means is everything your heroes do has to somehow move them closer to the climax. It could be that they're actively working to get there, or it could be they suffer a setback which slides them closer to the climax, right? It could be that they're actively doing it or not. Perhaps they're resisting the entire time, but they wind up there inevitably because of the events that unfold. Every little side quest that they do, every little subplot that you include in your book as the author, it all has to point towards the climax. Why do you have that subplot? Because it's going to be important at the end. And it's interesting enough on its own as you go, but then at the end you go, oh, of course, it never would have happened if that subplot hadn't played out first, right? So as an author, when you're looking at how to structure your book, I recommend starting with the end. Start with the climax. What do I want to happen at the climax? Okay, this is what I want to happen. So what do I need to set up before we can make that happen? So then you walk it back from there. And you can see, okay, well, I need to have that person in that position. I need to have this person feeling that way. I need to have these two in a relationship like this. So how do I get them there? And that's where your drama comes from, and that's where your story comes from. But everything is moving towards the climax.
I agree 100%, and you said that perfectly. I had in my notes to talk about, how do you hook everything into the climax, and how do you lead everything there and leave breadcrumbs and clues. And I think some of the best, even modern, recent books are the kind where you don't, you meet these characters, and you meet, and you kind of have these moments with some of these bigger, larger than life, maybe even like, bad guys, as it were, right? And then they get drawn into the big fight, but maybe they're on the good side or something, like, and you start to go, oh, like I can see why this was important maybe 2 books ago if it's a series, right? Or you start to piece together, little tiny Easter eggs. I think some of the best writing that I enjoy is when the author has left, like, the clues are small, like, for what's needed to make the climax, a win. If you're going for, that happily ever after of whatever genre you're writing, I think it's so fun to, like, to have that moment where you go, oh yeah, I forgot about that detail or that character or that thing that happened, and now I can see how important that is. And I think that really ties into human nature, and how we all want to see how our actions and our life is one piece of a bigger whole, and how we make a difference and how we matter. And those little things that seem like breadcrumbs or a side quest, and then when they come into that climax and they matter, that's speaking to us on a deeper level as humans. And I think that's why those kinds of climaxes that have those surprise bits that come in are extra satisfying, at least for me personally. But I think that does speak to humanity on a deeper level.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. That you said that feeling of, oh yes, it's the best feeling when you get to the climax of a book and you're just like, wow, I didn't see it coming, but at the same time it's inevitable, right?
Yes.
That's good writing.
Yes.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and it takes practice. Don't be wrong, it takes practice, and for any aspiring authors out there listening, like, you may not nail it your first time, but aim for it. Right? Aim for it. And I'm not saying that every single minor character in the book has to show up at the climax. Like, that's not what I'm saying. You might have a scene where your heroes are doing something and they have to interact with a minor character. Well, that's fine. It's not the minor character who is pointing us to the climax. The minor character is there to serve that scene, which is pointing us towards the climax. Right? That's the difference. So I just want to make that clear. It's not that, everybody shows up for this final, ensemble musical number to have the climax. But everyone serves a purpose, and if that minor character is to make that particular scene work, well, that particular scene is moving us in the direction we need to go, and that's what I mean by how everything points towards the climax.
Yeah, that's a good clarification, that it's not that everything has to. And in a way, that's what's fun, right? Because let's say there's 7 things that happen, side characters, side quests, side moments, things. Maybe only 3 are necessary for the finale, right? And you don't know which one it is, so that's kind of fun too. And so all of those little things, depending on your genre, like, they almost become automatic red herrings that you don't even have to work for, and they create the tension and the drama, and you don't know which thing is going to matter, and you have to try and pay attention. And I think that that even using one thing into your climax that you've used earlier on can add a little depth to your ending, to your big finale. And so it doesn't need to be huge. It doesn't need to be everything, like you said. It doesn't even need to be more than one. But even one can add depth. Yeah.
That little, cool.
Oh,
I remember that.
yeah, that moment. It's fun when that happens when you don't plan it. Have you ever had that happen when you don't plan it?
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely, yep. I was just thinking about recently. I was working on a ghostwriting project with another author. So it's his book, but I'm helping him write it. And he described to me a scene way back in Act 1. It's a scene that he wanted to have, which was dealing with our heroes and a character who was going to be very important in the third act. Which, by the way, this other character he hadn't even wanted to introduce until the third act, and I said, no, you cannot do that. If he's that important, we have to at least introduce him early on, and maybe have like you said, a red herring. You think he's one thing, but in the end, oh surprise, he's something else, which is really important. So anyway, there's that, where I'd convinced him to have a scene early on in the book, and he described to me the scene that he wanted me to write. I'm like, okay, I got it, yeah, this. But as I was writing it, I thought, you know what? I need another character here. Like, just the way the dynamic of the scene was playing out, I needed someone else. So I just, on the spot, I just created someone. Just someone kind of interesting and cool that I put in there. And he read the scene and went, we didn't plan on that other character. Who's that? I'm like, I don't know. But it made sense at the time while I was writing it. Organically, the scene needed that person. How that person is going to play into the climax, I have no idea. But I'm confident we'll figure it out. And so there was an example of the whole story got tilted just a little bit because in the creative process, I just had to make up a new character on the spot. The author liked it and went, okay, let's go with it. Okay, this is what she's going to do. This is how she's going to play in. I'm like, okay, good, let's do it. And it wasn't that I was forcing my own opinion onto this. It was more just I just felt as a creator the scene needed this, and the scene has to move us forward. But the author actually cottoned on to that minor character and went, nope, we're going to make her bigger, and she's going to do this. I'm like, brilliant. Now it all ties together that little bit better. So yes, it can certainly happen spontaneously, and it's great fun when it does.
It is. I do want to circle back to something you said, though, about how you cannot pull somebody in the third act and make them important in the climax. That's a pretty big no-no. You know, whether it's a artifact or some piece of magic or a certain person or an evil, villain or something, they cannot show up during the climax of your book. It's too convenient, it's contrived, it reads false, it reads like, oh shoot, I was writing this and I forgot to come up with something, so I pulled it out of my butt right now. I mean, it is an absolute no. You need to start those little hooks in the very beginning and work them through and build them up, not necessarily giving it away, but they need to, there needs to be sprinkling in of things that are going to be important. It's kind of like the bait and switch, right? So my biggest pet peeve on a lot of books that I read is that I'm going along and I'm thinking it's it's a contemporary fiction, blah, 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 a little bit of chick lit, whatever. And then suddenly one of the characters has a little bit of magic. And I'm like, no, you just broke a rule to make it easy for your climax to work. It's too convenient. No, you broke the cardinal rule of here's what you told me the book was, and now yes, you did a bait and switch, or you violated my trust as your reader, because now it's well, now anything can go. Now magic falls from the sky. Woo! So I think that, and there's some really big books that have done that. I'll say it. Outlander did it. There's always a little magic in there, but you kind of went with well, there's blood and there's genetics and there's this. Well, no, just Claire's magic. What? You can't do that. I put in a lot of time investing in these books. You can't make it convenient. So I think you have to sprinkle that in early on to work.
There's an example from a movie that I still remember years, decades later. It was Terminator 3, which we're not going to discuss in depth here, but just trust me that we were 90% through the movie, and our heroes were running for safety for some reason, and they ran into a hangar, and there were little planes there. And the heroine just said, oh yeah, I used to fly with my dad all the time, right? And I remember it because the audience around me in the theater even went, oh, come on. And it would have been so easy in that case to just, when you introduce the heroine, show her flying. and she lands the plane, and then she has the scene you wanted her to have, right? Easy, done. Now we now know she can fly, right? Because that's really important to the climax, that she can fly. And so it just struck me because the whole visceral reaction of the audience around me is like, yep, there it is. So all this to say to our dear listeners, think about your climax first. What do you want to happen there? What has to be in place for that climax to work? And what do you have to set up beforehand? And as you do that, that will help build the framework for your whole story. And think, okay, I need to make sure that that happens, and that happens, and that happens, and that happens beforehand. Okay, I will build my plot, making sure those things happen. And you may have other ideas, and you may have a forward trajectory to your plot. It's starting here and going this way. Great. But remember, these other things have to happen first before you get to your climax. So make sure to build them in to your plot. So that's it.
I think that's it. And I think a little plug teaser for a future episode is if you nail your climax, then you likely will avoid that saggy middle.
Yes.
Which we can talk about later. But
absolutely.
That's going to dovetail into that topic when we
one day we'll talk about saggy middles, but today is way more fun. We're talking about climaxes. So anyway,
perfect.
That's our
there we go.
Today, everyone.
Yes, yes, that is it. That is it. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any more of our very exciting chats like this one. And feel free to leave a review, which really truly does help us a lot. We do appreciate it. And please, if anyone is looking for help in getting their book ready for the world, besides listening to our podcast, you can also go to where we recommend our friends at Cascadia Author Services, and you can find them and read all about what they offer at CascadiaAuthorServices.com. And also, don't forget, you can look up Ben at BennettRcoles.com, as well as on Facebook and Instagram.
And you can catch up with Sara at SaraDalman.com and on Instagram. And thanks for joining us today, everyone. Please reach out if there are any topics you'd like us to cover, and we'll see you again when we next talk all about writing.
This has been All About Writing with Ben and Sara.